The widow slept sitting up with 4 boys in her lap. A rancher built her a bed. The first thing I noticed was the shoes. 4 pairs of them, lined up outside my barn door like she'd trained them to do it. Small. Smallest one couldn't have been more than a toddler's pair, worn through at both big toes. The leather was cracked and dark with old mud, and something that looked like it had been rubbed in to soften it, lard, maybe, or pine pitch. Whatever she'd had. I stood there in the cold with a pail in my hand, and I just looked at those shoes for a long moment. Then I looked up at the barn. Light inside. A sliver of it, warm and orange under the door. I'd found her wagon 2 days before. 3 miles off the Laramie Road, down in the creek bottom where the cottonwoods thinned out. 1 wheel off. The mule dead in the traces. I don't know how long it had been sitting there. Long enough that she'd burned everything she could afford to burn to stay warm. Long enough that the youngest boy had gone quiet in the way children go quiet when they've cried themselves past crying. She didn't ask for help. That's the thing I want to say first because it matters. When I came up through the brush on my gray horse and she heard me and turned around, she put those boys behind her. All 4 of them. She was maybe 30 years old and she was wearing a man's coat that was too big for her, and she had a single-shot pistol in her hand that I could tell from 20 feet away had a broken hammer. She held it anyway. I said, "I'm not going to hurt you." She said, "No. You're not." My name is Caleb Pryor. I was 51 years old that winter. I had run cattle on the same 2,000 acres since I was 23, and I had been alone on that land for the better part of 9 years, since my wife Nora took sick and the sickness won. I had a hired man named Tuck who came 3 days a week for heavy work, and otherwise I did not see many people and I did not seek them out. I want to be honest about what I was by that time. I was not a gentle man. I was not a cruel one either. I was a man who had worn his grief down into something functional, something that worked, the way a well-used tool works, with no shine left on it. I got them into the wagon with a fresh mule from my string, and I drove them back to my place. She sat up on the bench beside me and she didn't say 10 words the whole 3 miles. The boys were in the wagon bed behind us. I could hear them back there, little rustling sounds, low voices, the youngest one making a sound like a dove. Every now and then one of them would say something to her in a low voice and she'd answer without turning around. Short answers, steady ones. When we pulled into my yard and I got down and went around to help, she was already down and lifting the youngest out of the back. She did not want a hand. I said, "There's a room off the kitchen. It's dry." She looked at the house, looked at me. She had dark eyes, not black, but the kind of brown that goes dark in low light, and she looked at a man the way some people look at weather, trying to read what was coming. She said, "We won't be trouble." I said, "I know that." The room off the kitchen had been a sewing room when Nora was alive. After she died, I had put some things in it, a saddle that needed work, 2 crates of harness, a broken chair I kept meaning to fix. I moved all of it out that afternoon while she fed the boys at my kitchen table. I could hear them in there. The sound of children eating when they're hungry is something specific, fast and serious, barely any talking. I moved the crates into the barn and swept the sewing room floor, and I found an old wool blanket in the chest at the foot of my bed and put it in there. When I came back to the kitchen, she had washed the dishes. She was standing at my dry sink with her back to me, her sleeves pushed up, and the 4 boys were in a line against the wall in order of size. The biggest one, he was maybe 10, with her eyes and dark hair and a look on his face like a man who'd been making decisions he wasn't old enough for, was watching me the way a dog watches a stranger. Not mean, careful. I said, "I put a blanket in there." She turned around and dried her hands on her skirt. "Thank you." "There's no bed," I said. "Just the floor, I'll see about that." She said, "The floor is fine." Her name was Emmeline Voss. Her husband had been Franz Voss, German, she told me later, come over as a boy, never lost the sound of it in his speech. He'd been moving the family to a cousin's place in Wyoming Territory. jumped by 3 men on the Laramie Road for what little he had. She told me this 3 days after she arrived, standing in my kitchen while I was eating breakfast, and she told it the way a person tells something they've told before, flat and straight, all the feeling pressed out of it. I think she had told it to herself many times before she ever said it to me. The way you do when you're trying to make a thing survivable. I said I was sorry about her husband. She said, I know you are. The boys were named Eli, Martin, Joseph, and the little one was called Pip, which was not his name but what they called him. His name was Peter, but he'd been Pip since before he could walk, and that was what stuck. Pip was 3, Joseph was 6, Martin was 8. Eli was the 10-year-old with the careful eyes. The first thing I noticed about Eli was that he was always the last one to eat. The other boys would sit down, and Pip would climb up and reach, and Martin would argue with Joseph about something, and Eli would stand back and make sure they were all settled before he took his own place. I saw him do it 3 meals before I understood what I was seeing. He'd been doing a man's job inside that family since the day his father died. I did not know what to do with that. I am not sure I did the right thing. What I did was this: I put him to work with me. Not hard labor. He was 10. But I let him come to the barn in the mornings, and I showed him what I was doing, and I talked to him about it. How to check a hoof. How to read when a cow was about to drop a calf. The sound a pump makes when it's about to freeze and what you do about it. I told him things straight, the way you tell a young man, not a child. He listened the way the smart ones do still, eyes on you, not rushing to talk. The first week Emmeline helped me without being asked. She was cooking and cleaning and mending things in my house that had needed mending for years. I told her she didn't have to do that. She said, I know I don't. She kept doing it. There was a quality to her that I couldn't name right away, and then one evening I placed it. She was not waiting. Most people who come into a bad situation are waiting for something to change, for someone to tell them what to do next, for the storm to pass. Emmeline was not waiting. She was moving. Every day she got up and moved. It was not a thing she performed or announced. It was just what she did, the way a river moves, because stopping is not what rivers do. The second week, I went into town and got lumber. The room off the kitchen was 10 by 12. I built the bed frame first, solid pine, proper joinery, none of the slap-together work I might have done for my own use. I built it so it would last. Then I built a second, smaller one for the boys, wide enough for 4. I got a corn shuck mattress from the dry goods, and I got ticking for the pillow forms, and I got 2 new wool blankets. Emmeline was in the kitchen when I carried the frame in. She came to the doorway and watched me set it up. I didn't look at her much while I was working. I was fitting the side rails and it needed attention. When I was done, I stepped back and looked at it. She said from behind me, "You didn't have to do all that." I said, "I know it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's a good bed." "It'll hold," I said. "If I made it right, it'll hold another 40 years. I heard her breath change in a small way. Not a cry, nothing like that. Just a small change, like the sound a room makes when a draft moves through it. She said, "Thank you, Caleb." It was the first time she'd used my name. I don't know how to explain what those weeks were like inside my house. It had been a quiet house for 9 years, and now it was not quiet. Boys make noise the way weather makes noise, not purposeful, just constant, the sound of motion and existence. Boots on the floor. Arguing. The particular crash of something getting knocked off a surface. Pip's voice, which was high and earnest and made requests in a very serious way, as if he understood that the world responded better to gravity than to wheedling. I had forgotten what it felt like to have a house that was occupied. I want to be careful here because I don't want to make it sound like a thing it wasn't. There was nothing soft about those weeks. We were not a family. I was a man who had taken in a woman and her children because they had nowhere to go, and the alternative was not one I could live with. She was a woman who had lost her husband and her wagon and nearly everything else, and who was not in a position to be proud about where she sheltered. There was nothing romantic in it. There was practical need on both sides, and there was a certain kind of respect, the kind that develops between people who work, who do not complain, who do what wants doing without being asked. But I will say this. Something I had not thought about in a long time started happening again inside my house. I started caring what happened to the people in it. The third week, Tuck came by on his regular days, and he gave me a look when he saw the wagon in my yard and the boys running in the side lot. He did not say anything that first day. The second day he said, "You got visitors?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Staying long?" I said, "I don't know." He chewed on that and went back to work. Tuck was not a complicated man, and he was not an unkind one. He just wanted to understand the shape of things. Late afternoon he found me in the barn and he said, "Her husband." I told him what happened. He was quiet for a while, then he said, "She got kin anywhere?" I said, "The cousin in Wyoming is who they were going to. She wrote a letter, hasn't heard back." He nodded, looked at his boots, then he said, "Well, you got room." I said, "I got room." He nodded again, and that was all. I appreciated that about Tuck. He understood things without needing them explained twice. The letter from the cousin came in the 5th week. I was not there when she read it. I came in from the south pasture for dinner, and she was at the table, and the letter was in her hand, and Martin and Joseph were looking at her, and Eli was standing by the window with his arms crossed the way he did when he was trying to look older than he was. She looked up when I came in. She said, "The cousin died last fall. His wife's people took the property." I set my hat on the peg. I washed my hands at the basin. I took my place at the table. I said, "All right." She said, "There's nowhere to go." I said, "I know it." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I won't be a burden to you." I looked back at her. I said, "Emmeline, do you see any suffering on this ranch on account of you being here?" She looked at the table. Then she shook her head small. I said, "Then let's eat." I want to tell about the night in February, because that is the night I understood what she was, fully, and what I had let into my house and what it had given back to me. It was cold, a real cold, the kind that comes off the mountains with intention, that finds the gaps in your walls and reminds you how far you are from anywhere. I had been up 3 times already checking the stock, and I came back in the second time, and the fire in the main room was low. I built it up. When I turned around, she was standing in the doorway to the kitchen in a dark wool robe with her hair down, and I had not seen her with her hair down before. It was longer than I'd thought and dark, and she had a quilt around her shoulders. She said, "I heard you come in." I said, "Go back to sleep." She said, "Pip has a cough." I said, "I know. I'll ride for the doctor tomorrow if it's worse." She looked at me across the room. The fire was going well by then, and the light was moving on the walls. She said, "How long have you been watching over all of us like that?" I said, "Somebody has to." She crossed the room. She sat down on the bench near the fire and pulled the quilt tight, and she said, "Sit down, Caleb." I sat. We sat there for a while. The fire popped. Outside, the wind came around the corner of the house with a low sound. She said, "My father was a quiet man like you." I said, "What happened to him?" "Lived to 81, she said. "Died in his own bed." I said, "Good." She smiled. I had not seen her smile much. It changed her face in a particular way. It came slow, and then it was there completely. Not a half smile, but a real one that reached her eyes. She had fine lines around her eyes from squinting in the sun, and I noticed them now in the firelight. She said, "What happened to your wife?" I said, "Fever, 9 years back." She said, "You loved her." It was not a question. I said, "Yes." She knew that. I believe so. She nodded. We were quiet again, then she said, "You have been good to my boys." I said, "They're good boys." "Eli follows you like a shadow." I said, "He's the kind that wants to learn." She looked at the fire. She said, "He hasn't had a man to follow since France died. That's 8 months. He's been trying to do it himself, all of it, and he's 10 years old." Her voice didn't break. She was just telling me a fact. "I've been watching him try and I couldn't fix it. There's things a mother can't fix." I didn't say anything. She said, "You fixed it. I want you to know I see that." I looked at the fire. She said, "I see all of it. What you do, what you don't say, the way you treat us." She turned and looked at me then, direct, in that weathered way she had, the way she looked at things she wanted to understand. "You're a good man, Caleb Pryor. I know you haven't had anyone say that to you in a long time, but I want to say it now." The fire shifted. A log dropped and sent up a spray of sparks against the screen. I said, "You don't owe me anything." She said, "I know I don't." She looked at me for another moment. "That's not what this is." I didn't trust myself to speak right then. I turned back to the fire and I sat with it. After a while she put her hand on my arm. She didn't say anything. She just left it there, her hand on my forearm, through my sleeve, warm and steady. And I sat with that too. That was all it was, that night, just that. But I want to tell you something about being a man who has been alone for 9 years. When someone reaches out and touches you and means something good by it, just that, it takes a minute to remember that the world contains that kind of thing. That it's a thing that happens, that still happens, that is still possible. That you have not been removed from it permanently. I sat with her hand on my arm and I thought about Nora, which I used to do every night and had slowly stopped doing. And I thought about the sewing room with its new bed, and Pip's cough, and Eli standing at a horse's shoulder that morning with his face completely serious while I showed him about the hoof, and I thought, this is my house. This is what my house is again. In the morning Pip's cough was better. March came and the ground started to soften, and Emmeline asked me one morning if there was work she could do outside. I said there was always work. She said, "Show me." She was stronger than she looked. Ranching women usually are. She learned the chickens first, and then she started taking the morning milk, and she and Martin between them managed the kitchen garden when the ground allowed it. She had opinions about where to put things. I have to say I disagreed with her on the beans, and I was wrong, and she did not make much of it when I admitted that, which I appreciated. There was an afternoon in late March when I was repairing fence on the east side, and I looked up, and she was coming across the field with a tin cup of coffee, just walking through the new grass with the mountains behind her. The boys were somewhere back at the house, and it was quiet out there, and she walked across the field and handed me the cup and stood beside me while I drank it. Neither of us said much. I finished the coffee and handed the cup back, and she looked at the fence line. She said, "That's a lot of fence." I said, "It always is." She nodded and turned to go back, and then she stopped and said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "All right." She turned back around. She said, "Is there room here for us? I mean, is it something you want, not something you feel obliged to?" I looked at her. She said, "I need to know the difference." I said, "Then I'll tell you. When I came in that February night and the fire was low, and then I turned around and you were standing in the doorway, I was glad. Not obliged. Glad. That's the difference." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she nodded once, steady, the way she did everything. She said, "All right then." And she walked back across the field. I went back to the fence. By April we had a kind of arrangement. Not spoken exactly, but a shape. She managed the house and the kitchen garden and the chickens, and she'd started keeping the accounts, which I had always been bad at, and she was not bad at it. I managed the cattle and the land and tuck. The boys were in and out of both of our orbits, depending on the day, and Eli was mostly in mine. He had started waking up when I did without being called, which I noticed and did not mention. There was a man in town named Galt who had made a remark in the dry goods about the widow staying out at Pryor's. I heard about it third hand from Tuck. I rode into town the following week, and I went to the dry goods, and I told Galt that if I heard anything like that again, I would make it a problem for him in every way I was capable of making it a problem. Galt was not a small man, but he was not interested in testing that particular question, and I knew it by the way he held himself when I said it. I did not tell Emmeline about Galt. I did not think she needed to know. What she needed was for it to be handled, and it was handled. That is the difference between protection and controlling. I want to be clear about that. There is a man who protects a woman to own her. And there is a man who protects a woman because that is what she needs, and he is the one who can provide it. And he does not tell her about every small thing he has to walk through to make her world safe, because the point is the safety, not the credit. I am not going to claim I always knew which one I was, but I tried to be the second. The proposal, I don't know what to call it. It wasn't that. It wasn't formal. It happened in May when the calving was mostly done and the weather had turned, and the evenings were warm enough to sit outside after supper. She had started sitting on the porch in the evenings. I had started sitting there too. Not together exactly at first. She'd come out and I'd be there, or I'd come out and she'd be there. It became a thing that happened. Pip would usually be asleep by then, and Martin and Joseph would be inside, and Eli sometimes sat with us, on the step, quiet, which I had come to understand as his natural mode of being in a good situation. One evening she said, "What would you say to a minister coming out?" I looked at her. She looked back. She was not embarrassed and she was not performing casualness. She was just asking. I said I'd say yes. She said, "It's not what I planned." I said no. France and I had 20 acres in Wyoming in mind, a small house, something that was ours. I said, "This is 2,000 acres. I don't know if it's what you planned." She almost smiled. I said, "But if you could see your way to it, I'd like to spend the rest of whatever I have taking care of you and those boys. And I want that to be clear, not as a hand, not out of charity because you are." I stopped. I am not a man who finds words easily. I never have been, I said, because I think you are good, and I don't want to let go of that. She was quiet for a moment. Eli on the step below us had gone completely still. She said, "What made you say that? The part about good?" I said, "You've kept yourself decent through things that would have made other people mean. You didn't get mean." She looked at her hands in her lap, then she looked up. She said, "Neither did you." The minister came out in June. Tuck stood up for me. Emmeline's witness was Eli, who was 11 by then, who took the job with the gravity of a man twice his size and did not fidget once during the whole proceeding. Pip fell asleep standing up and had to be caught by Martin before he went down. After, when the minister had gone and Tuck had gone and the boys were inside, we stood in the yard in the last of the light. She looked at the mountains, then she looked at me. She said, "You're not sorry." I said, "Not for a second." She put her hand on my chest, just rested it there over my heart, like she was checking that something was still running right. She was looking at me with those dark eyes that went darker in the low light, and I could see in them what she saw when she looked at me, not a broken-down man or an old man or a charity case. Just a man she'd chosen. The whole weight of that just sitting there in her eyes. I put my hand over hers. The yard was quiet. Somewhere a bird was going at it in the cottonwoods. She said, "All right, Caleb Pryor." I said, "All right." In the morning I fixed the broken chair that had been in the sewing room before the bed. It had been waiting 9 years. I don't know why I hadn't gotten to it before. Maybe I just hadn't had a reason. I fixed it that morning and I set it in the corner of the room where the light came in, and I didn't say anything about it to anyone. She found it that afternoon. She sat in it and she looked at the window and she didn't say anything either. But she used it every morning after that. Every morning for a long time, sitting in the corner with the light on her and a cup of coffee, reading or thinking or just watching the yard. That chair is still there,